So the idea is sort of to branch out, but not to start out trying to get everybody, because I think that's a sort of a recipe to fail. If you're trying to, address everybody's needs, you're not going to address anybody's need.
I know that some people will say, don't create companies with your friends or start up with your friends because, it can tear up a relationship.
Show that we have a model that's working. We don't want to take in funding in order to sort of experiment and to try to find something that's working. We want to first show that this is working.
All right, so here we go. Aberisak, we didn't prepare you for this.
No.
We didn't tell you what this was going to be about. It's going to be obviously about the startup that we have in common, where we're both co-founders. We want to talk about that a little bit, but also go way back, because you and I go way back further than this product. You were one of the first persons I actually got to know when I moved to Sweden as a kid.
Yeah.
I mentioned that in a LinkedIn post as well that went kind of viral. That if it wasn't for you, I probably wouldn't have learned to speak Swedish as fast as I did, because I remember when we were kids. I was a weird kid, obviously. I'm sure the war had something to do with it. But I also remember, you were one of the first people that would laugh at my jokes when I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I think when you're that small, you needed any kind of approval from anybody.
Yeah.
And you were just generally liked as a person as well, and for myself as well. So we started hanging out a lot and got to know each other. And what I'm talking about here is first grade of elementary school.
Yeah.
How do you remember us? And you actually told me recently, I had forgotten this, how we got to know each other, but how do you remember our friendship starting?
To be honest, you're, of all of my friends, and first I have to say, I don't think you were a strange kid. I think you were a shy kid, like an introverted kid. And that's not necessarily a negative thing.
Oh, I was weird.
Yeah. That was your perception of you, at least. I thought you were one of the cool kids in school, but you were very reserved. Like there's kids. I was extremely I wouldn't say
outgoing,
extroverted, outgoing, whatever you want to call it. At that point in my life, I was into sports and all of these things. So I was always like the loudest kid in the class and sort of the clown in some ways. And you were more sort of the philosophical kind of person. I remember even as a child. I don't know if you remember this. No. You would think about, how was it before we existed? And you would think about things like this. And I was a kid, who thinks about not existing, as a child? And you would sort of discuss these sort of things. You were always very deep as a child. But the very first memory, if I'm going to be honest with you, the very first memory, it was in our school, Slottsbergsskolan, which is a sort of a local school here in Gothenburg in the west of Sweden. And you came up to me, we were playing football. And I was maybe 7 years old then, or something like that. Was it first grade?
Yeah, first grade, 7.
Yeah, definitely first grade. And this is actually the earliest memory I have of a friend who I'm still friends with. And you asked me hi, my name is. You said, hi, my name is Senad. I'm a Muslim. Are you also a Muslim? And it was the strangest way to introduce yourself. And I think maybe it has something to do with coming from Bosnia
100%.
and the sort of the schisms that you had there, because you have obviously there's a lot of tension during the war.
I think more so than anything else, because I had forgotten about that, and once you said that to me, some memories started coming back, and I think I remember my mom telling me Aberisak, the black kid, he's a Muslim just like you, and I probably didn't even know what it meant by then, but I guess you're looking for any kind of connection with anybody, any kind of camaraderie, and I guess that was the first thing that I said to you. But
that was one. I remember this clear as day. I don't remember often when I meet meet a person the first time, but in your case, I actually do remember. Yeah. It was like we're playing football, and then you just came up to me and you said that blank, and I was in shock. What? First and foremost, you're white. How can you be Muslim? Aren't you supposed to be brown? And,
all the natural questions that came up.
And
explain yourself.
Yeah, and I was very ignorant, obviously, because I only knew about, I came from the Somali community, and those were the only people I knew of that faith.
Right.
So it was a bit of a shock for me. But then we became friends quickly after that. And even till this day, I think you're my oldest friend. It's you and Simon, I think, a guy who also lives here, who are probably the people who I still know, from early childhood. There's a couple of other guys, but they came I became friends with them later in sort of primary school.
It goes three ways. It's me, Simon, and you as well. I got to know Simon a little bit earlier than you, maybe 6 months when I went to kindergarten with him, and then it was you. Yeah. And like you said, we kind of stayed friends all throughout. we kind of went our own ways a little bit throughout high school because we went to different high schools, but still kept in touch all throughout, and then came back to college. And that was a very odd experience as well because I studied IT. I always felt like you should have studied IT to this day.
Yeah.
You obviously...
I was very, very close to joining you because before you started college, actually, the university, we went to the same university. You went to a high school that was geared towards IT. And I was like this close to switching, because you had like you had like a candy machine, you got computers, and I got drawn by all of that. And I'm sorry, you can continue.
Yeah, no worries. Exactly. I remember you asking me at the start of high school, what's it like at your high school, and I remember high school as well. You picked your high school based off of so basic things. I remember they had more comfortable chairs than at your high school. I was like, I want to have a comfortable chair at high school.
Not
thinking things through much. But I wanted actually to study architecture, didn't have the grades for it, chose to study IT, and you chose to study civil engineering.
You had the skills for it, though.
I guess so.
You would do my homework in art class.
Forgot that. yeah, exactly.
Because I'm completely inept at drawings. I couldn't draw.
But you got a better grade in art class than I did in elementary school, and I did your work.
Yeah.
It just goes to show that he liked you better than me, but that's all right.
It's very strange. But he liked me a lot, actually, for some reason, the art teacher.
But then in college, I didn't hang out with the kids at IT too much. I hung out with Nicola, obviously. But then it was mostly you, me, Moni, and Mike, all from different educations, basically sat, every evening, every weekend together. You guys would open up some of the areas in the civil engineering department there for us to sit, and we would spend our weekends there, and we would, talk so much about the different ideas that we had. So it was a kind of because all of us, to some extent, were entrepreneurial in nature because we all wanted to have the next big idea and always thinking about, what kind of business we could start. Yeah. And it almost felt like school was holding us back to some of these things.
No, I remember exactly those terms. School was holding us back.
Every time, because I remember 2 or 3 times we started some project that maybe could have been a really good thing. But then exam period comes up and you have to focus on that, and then a few of those went down the drain, unfortunately. But
no, I remember those things. You would get yourself hyped up on an idea. And for that day, it was like the greatest idea you ever had. And then you would wake up the next day and like, that was this most garbage piece of, idea.
Because the hype would get you. But you know what it is? I've found that throughout the years, the ones that stick around, like the ideas that even they survive the night, as we call it, and then the next night and the next night, and they keep coming back. Those are the ones that are really good. And those are the ones that we've generally started companies around as well, Nicola and I.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that sort of the idea that haunts you is the one that you should dedicate yourself to. Obviously, given that if it's a good idea.
Exactly. You can never know.
And truly, you never really know, because you do have, obviously in some cases you have where people look at something and they say, well, this is obviously the future, and this is going to be the future. Like self-driving, everybody knows that's going to come at some point. And then you have some things that are like, this is insane and crazy, and only few people believe in it. Yeah. Sort of like an Airbnb situation where you're gonna live in a stranger's home. Like,
I think our ideas were, because none of us came from the mentality or the idea that we were gonna look for venture capital.
No.
It was always, we were gonna build it from scratch, no matter how many hours it took, we would do the investments.
Yeah.
And then because we knew that there's a finite amount of hours and resources we could put in it, we would generally tend to think a little bit smaller than the biggest ideas. It wouldn't be global ideas. It was just something to get us off the grid. That was always the idea, to have enough money not to have to get employed anywhere.
That's true.
And
no, that was the get for like from literally the first day of when we started going together at the university. And this is the University of Chalmers, which is a local university that sort of focuses on engineering and science related subjects. I would say it's the premier one in the country.
If we might humbly say so.
Some people in Stockholm would have a different opinion, but they would be wrong. But essentially, I remember even as kids, we used to go by the tram station because the university is like near the tram station, and we'd point and we'd say like, oh, someday we're going to go there, Yeah. So I think our parents sort of imprinted that into us, the whole engineering side, at least for me. I don't know how it was for you.
Certainly the same thing. A lot of everything I did in life was, for the approval of my parents. So that was another one of those.
I think that's a big thing. Like, you had amazing parents who would help you with like homework and support. And I remember your father once said, we had like an exam. This was in 9th grade or something, when we were about 15 years old or something like that. And he said, like, an exam, it's like cheating, he said. Yeah, remember this? He said, like, because you can just memorize it, and then you have it in your head. It's like you're cheating from the sort of the list that you have in your head. And I thought, like, okay, that's a very interesting way of looking at it, but it's true. Like, especially if it's an exam where if you come prepared, you can succeed. Because I think the most challenging things in life are the things that you really can't prepare for in that way.
Yeah.
Whereas an exam, you have a lot of control. If you come prepared, you'll do good.
Yeah, it was always about that, like putting in the time, because that's really what he was saying. If you put in the time and sit down with your book and memorize what's in there, then it's like cheating in that sense. So I don't know what to say. I mean, the only differences that me and my father had in that sense was that, he came from, a former communist country. Yeah. So his idea of success was a stable job, right? Because his parents probably didn't have that, right? So he was like, oh, you can become an engineer so you can get a stable job. And that's where kind of my entrepreneurship side, I didn't get what he was trying to get me to do, because it sounded so horrible to me to get a stable job. But I think it was around college that I realized that, life doesn't have to be that. You can create anything you want to create. And obviously, I studied entrepreneurship after that, where they kind of decoded our brains to actually believe that as well. Yeah. And I remember, because I mentioned earlier that, our ideas were always small, and then we hadn't seen each other for a while, in a few months, and we sat down. I remember it was in McDonald's, and you were like, you told me, what we were talking about earlier, trying to create these websites, passive income, this and that. We got to stop doing that. We got to start thinking bigger, venture capital. Yeah. I still wasn't quite getting it, because I had some success with the website that I was creating as well at this point. But it was the first time I started thinking, okay, maybe we can start thinking bigger. And that brings me, to the next part, which is a startup that we actually did found together at some point. And I was just, throughout the years, I was just trying to find the one thing that we could do together. I know that some people will say, don't create companies with your friends or start up with your friends, because, it can tear up a relationship. But I've also come to find that if the ambition level is parallel to each other, then it hasn't been a problem. When the ambition level is off, if you're very ambitious or your partner is more ambitious than you, then it could be tough, because then it's always going to be a situation where one is trying to drag the other one along with them. And I knew with you, I've known you my entire life. I know that you have the work ethic for this. I always felt like we need to start a startup. And, you had a different journey than me. I went into business directly, but you went and got your PhD. Through that process, you came to the idea of what today became Avidnote. So if you can tell us how that went.
I can explain that journey a bit. Like, as you said before, like we used to always try to come up with things to do during college years. Like for me, it's actually started before college, to be honest. It was around when I did my senior year or something along those lines, or maybe, I don't know what you call it, the sophomore is the equivalent in the US, where you're in high school, the second year. And I started a website. It was like for study techniques and these sort of things. And I wrote an ebook back then. It was very popular to write ebooks. And I remember I got my first check. I still have it somewhere from ClickBank, it was called. I don't know if the company's still around.
Yeah, it's around.
They're probably still around. They do like affiliate stuff and stuff like this. And if you read the book today, it's like, you look at the grammar mistakes and the syntax errors, and it's pretty like difficult to look at it for myself. But I used to sell it, and I used to teach like study tips and techniques, and of course I was ignorant myself. I was a student, but I figured like the best way to learn is to teach yourself. So during that time, the whole idea was to try to never have a real job. That was sort of the because I was wired I was wired to do that from very early age. And from my experience, I didn't really come from that same background, because my father, we came from what is Somaliland, or back which is sort of a very difficult way to explain, but it's in the northern part of Somalia. It's a breakaway republic. But essentially, when I was born in Somalia during a civil war. So I was born during that age, and then we came to Sweden. And if you look at sort of the culture in Somali culture in general, it's very nomadic. So the idea is that you're very independent, and you don't follow structure.
Touché.
Structure is the last thing you want. So typically, like the nomad, they live like scattered. Some day they're here, the other day they're somewhere else, and you just live off of the land. And so in that sense, it's a very independent lifestyle. And once you go into a lifestyle where it's more, you expect a paycheck and you have to go and follow order, and there's like a nation state, it's a very different environment from like what sort of we're ingrained with. And my father really came from that background. And he was like when he grew up, he really grew up not in the city. He went to the city later, so the city where we lived or where he lived in Somalia or Somaliland. But he at that time, I remember he used to like when you're like a shepherd, but not for sheep, but for camels. He would follow camels, and the camels were like they would take you somewhere distance, and people were like very, very liberal with how they handled like. Sort of parenting, if you can say that. Okay. Because at one point he said, I remember this, very interesting. He said like his parents, they told him to go take the camel and like bring it and feed it and come back, and the day before, like a kid had just gotten like eaten by a hyena, I think, or something like that, and he was sent to the same place. So it's like, man, it's a rough generation. Like he could never imagine like doing that to his own kids, like putting them. But at the same time, it was like you're supposed to be tough. It's a very like independent. You build like tough people. So that was sort of the mentality of it. So when he came to Sweden, he actually wanted to start things, and he did start like a company together with some of his friends where they were doing logistics, and that didn't work out in the end. So he always had like ideas, and he would do real estate investments. So he always came from that, like try to do something for yourself. So I was sort of ingrained in that. But back to your question, once we went to university, I stayed at the university and against all good wisdom, because most people typically when they do their bachelor's, they're like, oh, do I have to do a master's? Like. And then once they do their masters, they can't handle any more. Like they can't handle coursework and learning in a university environment. Obviously, people learn all the time. But for me, I felt like I either had to like start a company that was serious, or I would continue in academia, because that was sort of a similitude to having a company. It's the closest thing outside of sort of having your own company where you're free to set up your own times. So when I was working at Chalmers as a researcher, first a PhD student and then I was a researcher, you had complete control of your time. They called it förtroendearbetstid in Swedish, which is very difficult to translate, but it's like you as long as you do the work, you can do whatever you want.
It's trust-based, basically.
Yeah, it's trust-based time. So you don't clock in, you don't clock out.
Right.
You work from home, you work from abroad, and I would just travel around and I would work from different countries and do my research. So I loved the process, to be honest. And it was sort of a very comforting environment, sort of, because you had the paycheck, and I think there's a saying in the Valley where they say like the most addictive thing in life is coffee, cocaine, and a paycheck. I think if you want to do anything like serious entrepreneurial, you have to take like a step into the abyss and sort of jump out without having that safety net. And as long as you have the safety net, you don't really pursue it 100%, is my idea. Maybe some people have been able to do it, so I'm not going to obviously generalize for all people in all times. But at least for myself, my whole idea with the university, as soon as I even got in, was to drop out. that was really the goal, because that was sort of all of the greats had done it, sort of, the Bill Gateses and the Jobs and the whatnot and the Zuckerbergs. But they all went out during their sort of undergraduate degree. And once I graduated, it was like, oh, I guess I have to continue, because the other alternatives, I have to go into the real world and get a proper engineering job. And I then, stuck around. I did my master's, and I figured at least I can sort of drop out from my master's and come up with something, and then focus on that. And I think I actually had one opportunity when I was talking about the other website that we had at the time, where I don't think would never become a scalable venture product. But it would, I think, if I put in the time, considering it was generating a lot of income for me, enough to pay for my rent and for my food. I believe if I perhaps had sort of skipped and focused, you actually told me to. I don't know if you remember this. Yeah. You told me to drop out at that point, but I didn't. And what happens is what always happens. You get sort of bogged down with all of the coursework, and I couldn't focus on my site, and then sort of all of that went away. And once I started my PhD, I figured, well, I couldn't be like the Jobses of the world, but maybe I can be like, the Larry Pages and the Google founders, they did their PhD and they dropped out of their PhD.
True.
So I figured at least now I have like all of these years and I'm gonna drop out from my PhD. That was honestly my intention when I went into it.
Yeah.
But then I sort of kept failing upward in the academic hierarchy. And I had this idea for Avidnote during that time, during my PhD. And essentially the idea was, and I can sort of describe the problem set before I describe the solution. If you look at a modern day scientist or a researcher, essentially it looks exactly the same. You have the same scattered, papers all over the place. The only addition is that you have sort of a monitor. But people still take notes by hand, and then they sort of annotate, and then they send it to each other. So if we have meetings, we're doing a research project, we sit just like we're sitting now, and we're sort of sharing notes and going through research papers that we've read and things that we need to do. Everything is very manual. It's not digital and analog. So essentially, I figured, like, why is this? Surely there has to be like a better way, because you can't keep track of all your notes. You have like a desk filled with research notes and research notebooks that are like scribbled all over the place, and you can't search through your notes, you can't organize them, you can't tag them. And I figured there has to be a better way where you can digitalize this. And I tried to look for a solution. And when I couldn't find a solution that was sort of customized for the academic writing experience, I figured, well, why not build it myself? And I remember the real epiphany was when I was part of a sort of a workshop for PhD students at the time. And they were talking about research utilization and how you can improve your research work and different tools you could use and stuff like this. And these were people from different branches of sort of science, like from chemistry, physics, from engineering, from other parts of sort of the research field, people in management and so forth. And they all had the same problem, like we can't keep track of our notes and we can't keep track of all, like literally this was like a consensus thing. And at that point it hit me, like I literally couldn't wait to just leave the meeting because I felt like I should start working on this.
Got gold.
Yeah, I felt like I should just leave now. But I went back and I made like a very simple landing page, like the first homepage for the idea. I described it in sort of in details of what it was going to do and what it was doing right now. And then I made a very basic, it was a very basic, like off-the-shelf note-taking app that I put in there. And people were like very excited. I posted about it on some social media, on Reddit and some other places. Yeah, and people were like raving, like, "Oh, we need something like this. Is amazing. When are we going to release the features where you can keep track of the references and sort of build it full scale instead of this very simple version at the time?" And I then sort of time went on, and this was sort of in the middle of or the tail end of my PhD. And as soon as I finished my PhD, I decided I'm going to work on this like full time. Because I had a decision right there and then to either go to industry, which was never an option for me, to be honest, never, or to continue on in the research world, which as much as I preferred the entrepreneurial world, I still had some sort of like inklings towards research. Sort of a very abusive relationship, Sometimes you love it, sometimes you hate it. And I think most researchers, they feel the same way because sometimes it's like this greatest thing in the world. You're going to all these conferences, you're producing work and you think you are someone. And then on the tail end of it, it's like, oh, I'm useless and not useless, but you get like rejected for your papers and
the same could be said for entrepreneurship, I think.
Yeah, it's true.
It's got
true.
both sides as well.
Exactly. So I decided, no, I'm going to go do this like full time, and that's when we met again, really. And at this point, you've already built like a very successful IT consultancy with Zendev, and you've done something really amazing over there. And I was speaking with some other friends who are also co-founders of Avidnote, and they said you should do this full time. And I figured, I've got nothing to lose. I have savings enough to cover my living expenses. So I started working on it full time, developing the wireframe for the actual full scale sort of MVP that we did. And then we figured, should we do this like outsource? And I figured it's not good to outsource things because if you don't control sort of the process of the technical part, you can't really call yourself a tech company, I think. Yeah. You need to have it in-house. And it just so happened I happened to know a very talented guy within IT who had people who were working for him who were very talented developers. Yeah. And it made like total sense. So it was another co-founder who actually mentioned it. It's like, why not Senad? Like, just talk to him. And we spoke and you figured, well, it sounds like a good idea. And
it was just an accident. I was just visiting to Sweden during that period, and I called you for coffee, and you told me about this, and you had another idea that was kind of like one that you could do by yourself, but this is one that had been lingering. And I think I feel like, this is the big one I mentioned earlier, that we were always, talking small in a sense. This is not one of those projects. This is an all-in kind of project. Like if we're going with this, we're going to go, the route of venture capital, because we want to run fast. And it's literally like, if you put it in one line, digitalizing the process that researchers go through today. And that's big enough to be global, like one of those really big startups. So I think we knew right away that we wanted that, and the people that were involved obviously was us from the tech side. We were lucky that we could set aside some resources to do that, and didn't have to pay a lot of money for that because we had our own in-house people. And then we had very good. I mean, everybody knows this in the world of entrepreneurship, that it's always about team, right? And even more so that I trusted in the product. I trusted that you would be able to pivot enough times until it became a great product. Because I've worked so many years with you that I know that you know what a great product is. You know what a good feel is. You know what a product market fit is. And it's almost like you went by the book and did all the right things in a venture capital based system, right? You went to Reddit and asked for your first feedback, and then we iterated, created an MVP 1.0, got feedback on that one. And I mean, it's been such a fun journey, and the application that we have today, and some people that use it today perhaps don't know that it's actually the second version, completely different from the first version. Can you tell us what happened between those two phases, phase one and phase two of the application?
Process, it's been very codified now, I think, in the startup world, that you work in this sort of iterative process where you test everything. So it's much more akin to the scientific method in that sense, that you have an hypothesis of something, you believe it's going to be in some way, and you have a very strong feeling that it's going to be like, I know the problem myself. So, if you're solving your own problem, at least you'll have one customer, and you have to find somebody else who's like you. But in the scientific sort of method, you do that, and then you test it. If it doesn't work, you try something else, right? And so what we did was we figured we have to do an MVP. And the whole concept of an MVP, or a minimum viable product, I think the whole term was probably coined by, I don't know if it was coined, but it was certainly popularized by Eric Ries in his book, The Lean Startup. And I think after him, everybody sort of adopted it as the standard way of operating a startup company. And the whole idea is, instead of building something like you used to do back in the days, where you would work on a very big project for a long time, and then you release it, and then you just expect people to either adopt it or not. Obviously, that costs a lot of money, a lot of dev time, and you don't really know if what you're building is sort of accurately addressing the needs of your users. You have an idea of it, but you don't really know it until you get the sort of input from those users. So with this whole methodology is built upon that. You always test, you don't assume, and once you get something, you focus on that sort of the thing that works. So what we did was we built an MVP in the style of that sort of philosophy, and it was supposed to be like, I think there's Michael Sibel, I think from YC, has a very beautiful saying of this. He says, you're supposed to build something, an MVP, not in months, but in weeks. Because if you're building something that's really large, it's not really an MVP. You're trying to build something that's really proper. And there's another saying as well that, if you're not sort of ashamed of your MVP, you've released too late.
Yeah, but it's so tough. I just want to give some pushback on that, and not to you, but to that whole, that keeps going back and forth so much in that whole industry. Some will even, yesterday I was watching a video, he's like, oh, forget MVP, it should be MRP, minimum remarkable product. Well, if it's remarkable, and it's, people get stuck on the M in a sense that, it's supposed to be minimal, but it's like the V is everything. Is it viable or not? Because a lot of people will say, oh, my idea didn't work because, I put something out there that didn't adopt it. Yeah. It's so hard to know if the V was was this viable for your target audience? Yeah.
No, I agree with you entirely, in terms of it being something that's valuable. But I think the viable part of it is sort of, is it something that we can do that's sort of, it explains the purpose of it. So if you have a glass, this is a very well-designed glass, but you could drink from something that's sort of an ugly container, and it's still going to give you the same function of being able to hold water. And so when you're building an MVP, you're not building this, you're just building some sort of container that's, you can fill like a liquid into it, and it works. And then people can give you feedback like, oh, this doesn't look good, doesn't feel good, but at least it's, satisfies my desire to drink. So the viable part of it is sort of focusing on that aspect. So for us, it was like, how can we build something where we don't need to put in like half a year's work, where we could put in a few weeks, or like in this case it was 2 months, I think it took all in all. Like how can we put in this amount of work to produce something that adequately addresses the needs of the users and gives us at least a sort of a hint or an indication that there is something here. And once we released it after those 2 months, we got like, I don't know, at the time it was like maybe 500 researchers who signed up like almost immediately. And it was people from different universities, like all over the world. And this was some of the exciting thing about it. Like you have sort of a lot of different startups in this field that focus on a specific segment of the sort of the science and research and the academic market, it's what it's called, where they focus on, for instance, like math-related software that's only applicable to people who do math or physics, but it's not really applicable to somebody who's doing like field work, in a qualitative science. And then you have like R&D companies, like Benchling, that focuses on life science and trying to, map the genetic, like use the software to map out the genetics and stuff like this. But with Avidnote, it's sort of cross-discipline in that sense that every researcher, regardless if they're like a mathematician or if they're doing more qualitative science, they still have to keep track of their research notes. And
Right.
this is also, I think, to be honest, a sort of misconception of the scientific process and the research process itself by a lot of people, is that you have this idea, sort of a Archimedes archetype, where you have this eureka moment, you're sitting in the lab and you come up with this brilliancy. And yes, that might be true for some people, but for most researchers, that's not how it works. They actually sit in rather morose settings where they're like very painstakingly, you have to read through a lot of papers and a lot of documents, and you have your desk filled with this. And this is how research is mostly conducted. So like the average researcher reads about 300 papers per year. So like most of your work as a researcher is actually just reading stuff. So in order to write like one line of like a sentence, it's not like writing a blog sentence. It has to like be based, obviously factually correct, and fit in within the article that you're reading. So in order to write that one article, you have to read or that one line, you have to read like 10 or 20 papers, or like skim through them and try to find that, and then you have to quote it and keep track of all your references. So essentially, when we built it, we released it to these, I think we're about 500 people or 700, I don't remember the exact number, around 500 I think signed up immediately, and then a few more people came during that early phase. And these people were like from different universities. Most were from the US, like from the big universities, the small, like MIT and Stanford, but also like smaller colleges. We had people from like the public school systems like using it. In Chicago, we had like 30 people, I think, who signed up. So obviously, like people more on a high school level, because I think, regardless of where you are in the research phase, you need to keep track of your documents in a systematic way. And in that sense, Avidnote has sort of some utility for you. So once we got the early feedback, we noticed exactly as you said, that yes, it did give us some positive indication that this is useful, because first, a lot of people signed up. The conversion rate was very high. It was above 20% for the landing page. And we figured, like, people are signing up. People are like raving about it on the comments, like, oh, this looks amazing. When are you going to add this? When are you going to add that? So people wanted us to add like reference management. At the time, we didn't have that because there's like other reference management software that you can use, like Mendeley and Zotero. So they said, like, could you integrate this with this? And could I sort of highlight the text and work with the document in a much more sophisticated way? Because in the early version that we released, we had like, so if you look at the Avidnote interface itself, like you go into your PDF document that you're reading. It could be any type of document really, but it's mostly used for research because it's customized for that specific use case. Sort of on the left side you have or on the left side you have sort of where you're writing all your notes, and you can write it in longer format. You can write basically entirely whole chapter if you so desire. On the left side you have your PDF document, and then these two are connected, right? So if you write something here, it's always connected to that document, and then you can annotate within that document itself, the PDF, and you can highlight and annotate and stuff. So this is the current version of Avidnote. But in the first version, simply due to the lack of time and resources, we figured make it as easy as possible. Just connect it with a sort of a PDF SDK that we used, the software development kit that was very basic. where as a user you couldn't even highlight, I believe, the text at that point, and you couldn't sort of, and so we got like dozens upon dozens of sort of comments, people saying like, I want to highlight this, please, like I want, please. And somebody said like, this would be a very useful tool to us if you could only like fix this.
Yeah.
And it was like a reoccurring feedback. And we noticed like people were very excited about the product, but because there was a sort of a hindrance, because we use such a basic PDF SDK that wouldn't really allow you to copy text over and highlight text from the PDF itself into the text area that you're writing, we figured like, okay, we have something here, it's serious, because people are interested, they're staying, but they weren't staying for very long because of the issue with the PDF SDK. So we decided we have to build a very robust, proper version of this. So we
exactly, and that brings me back to what we were talking about earlier, you know, the V in the MVP. I mean, theoretically, you could say that the version that we have right now is our MVP because it's the first one that's viable.
Yeah.
Or you could have said that we have an MVP 1, and if we didn't take in that feedback, we would have just said, oh, you know, this product didn't work, it didn't have enough retention rate. But thanks to you, you know, digging into this, asking all the right questions, setting up, you know, Mixpanel to have all the statistics of what's happening, we got to understand what the issue was, and we could iterate on the product, and now we have what we think is product market fit at this point. And everybody knows that once you get to that point, you know, if you're lucky enough to get to that point, then it's time to start thinking about scaling, right?
I just want to add something.
Go ahead.
I don't know if you should cut that part though, because I'm gonna go a little bit inside.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. They're gonna love it.
I'm gonna cut and everything, because I think the idea of product market fit, as it's defined, is when you get so much traffic and so much traction that you literally can't function. So I think that obviously there's a difference of definition wise. Like if you look at, for instance, you talked about a very valid point. You said like you could look at this version as an MVP, and that's completely fine. And in IT, I think people are very like very disorganized with labels. Like, is this alpha version? Is it beta version? Is it MVP? It's all a big mess, you know. I think you can just talk about it, the early version that you produced, and then the later version, because you can never talk about a finished product in IT. There's no such thing as a finished product. You're always sort of iterating and improving, and hopefully you're going towards increased sort of efficiency and within the product or increased functionality that addresses the needs of the users. But the idea of product market fit, as I see it, and I know there's differing opinions, but I think I agree with the opinion more of sort of Gustav Alströmer, who's he grew up here in Sweden. I think he actually came, I'm not entirely sure, but I think he might have been from the same city as us as well. I know he had a talk here at Chalmers not too long ago. But he's been a general partner at YC. He worked at Airbnb and basically was part of the founding team that helped scale the Airbnb. And his definition of sort of product market fit is much more stringent in that you know that you've reached product market fit when you're exploding with your servers are crashing. You're getting so many calls, so many emails, like you can't handle it. You're literally suffering from sort of success. And I think at that point, I'm not sure I would entirely put us at that point.
If it's by that definition, I wouldn't either, because it's not having that viral effect, because we haven't built in virality. You and I know that we're working on that as well. But I mean,
we definitely, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we definitely have stickiness in the product.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the biggest thing.
Right.
Because if you can't have stickiness and you can't have retention, like long-term retention in your app is going to become completely useless. And I think you have some experience from this as well. Like if the first thing you look at is like the retention rate, and if it's like because for every site, regardless of if you're Facebook or whatever, it always goes down. So like if you look at 100 people now and you look 3 months later, how many people are still using it, it's never going to be 100%, right? But it's going to sort of flatten out. And you don't want it to flatten out at zero, because that means no matter how much traffic, no matter how good the marketing, no matter how good of the growth team, like you could have Chamath as your growth guy and it doesn't matter because you're going to leak out, like everything's going to leak out. So you have to have retention and stickiness. That's why we decided we're not going to commercialize it in the first version that we released, because we saw that the stickiness was not there. We saw that the conversion was there. People were very excited. People liked the product and kept mailing us like when are we going to release the new version. Once we released the new version, we can now see that people who signed up like in March, in February, they're still using the app till this day, and this is like I don't know, 6 months later or something.
Yeah.
And so you can see the sort of the retention in the app has become like a lot better.
I don't know. It's an interesting definition that Gustav has. I don't know if I agree with it. I mean, the retention or the product market fit to me is that the people that have gotten it in front of them and tested it, they get to stick to the product, right? It's not a hole in the bottom of the glass. And how you actually get, the water in the glass or the people into the product, that can be very difficult in different scenarios. So, it can be based on different marketing schemes you have or how you set that up. But for me, the product market fit is the people that actually register, and that's an art in itself, how to get them there to actually register. Once they get there, that a high enough, we've talked about this many times, that the lifetime value doesn't exceed, the cost of acquiring them there. And I think we could go on and on about this. For the people that are interested in this, I think you and I, the way you talk, you and I have looked at the same YC Combinator videos as well, and educated ourselves a lot from there as well.
Yeah, there's no one fit answer, I think, to a lot of this. And these are definitional questions, like definitional issues. Yeah. And this is very, very common in the research world as well. Like you use a term, and then you're talking about the same thing, but you're not really talking about the same thing. So I mean, for some people, if you can define, it doesn't really matter what you call it, if you're being honest. Yeah. But if you define like product market fit to be, we have a product that's working, it's not leaking, people are staying, people are using it, it's addressing their needs. And if we now pump in sort of capital into it, it's going to grow, because we can show that the more we put in, the more it grows. I think that's a perfectly valid definition. Yeah. I think so. Yeah. But the other definition is much more stringent in that sense. But I think also it's much more of a challenge, because that's really when you know that your product has reached sort of the zenith of its viral growth.
Viral, exactly.
And I think just to add one more thing here is that the product itself has a sort of a viral component to it. So if you look at sort of how Avidnote is structured, because we're sort of the users, we have a freemium version, so you can sign up as a free user, you can try it out for as long as you want, really. And then in the pro version, you get more storage space, and we'll add on more functionalities that are customized towards the pro functionality, including sort of how you build your research team and so forth. And then you have it on the sort of department level also. You can buy it for an entire department, for a university department, or for the entire university or institution. So if you look at it from that angle, because we're building it bottom up, and usually people call this like the B2C to B model, like business to consumer to business, or it's called consumerized SaaS, bottom up SaaS. I think David Sachs from Yammer is one of the people who really made this term famous and pioneered it with his company. And the idea is that you try to get into the organization at the bottom level. So you reached at the universities at individual researchers, and they adopt it, they share it amongst themselves, and this is what we're seeing. We're seeing people sign up, for example, at the University of Princeton University, and then we see a lot of other people popping up from that same university and from the same department. So you can see they're sharing it with themselves. And then, the more it sort of shares, it grows organically within the organization. And then it becomes much more easier to have the conversation regarding sort of selling the software to the entirety of the organization. And this is really nothing new in that sense. I mean, it's been done before with something like Yammer, but also Slack is even more famous now with how fast they reached the level they reached through this sort of bottom-up approach. And so the idea with Avidnote was always to focus on this segment to begin with, the sort of the academic market, where we know we can grow fairly quickly because we have this sort of viral component structure already built in, where you have people within the departments and they work together in teams. So all of this is already based. So you can sort of base your sort of marketing and growth strategy based on that. And then once you sort of reach a much higher growth rate and you reach like a critical mass, you can sort of sell to the individual universities and then also to enterprises that deal with a lot of technical documentation or R&D work. So I would argue we have people in the app now that are like accountants. We have like a VC who's using it. He actually uses it quite often to sort of keep track of all of his pitch decks. He has a pitch deck and you have all of these different companies and keeping notes on all of the companies. So essentially it's really a tool to keep track of research, like period. And research is done in universities, but it's also done in market research in companies throughout the world. So the idea is sort of to branch out, but not to start out trying to get everybody, because I think that's a sort of a recipe to fail. If you're trying to, address everybody's needs, you're not going to address anybody's needs. I think the Italians have a saying. They say, "The man who loves every girl loves no girl," and I think, sort of it's discriminatory. Similar to love, I think it's discriminatory in that you have to focus on the core believers in your product, the people who actually. Not just the first adopters, but the people for whom this has been designed for their needs, and that was what I was lacking when the whole thing started, and so we focus on this aspect, and then you can sort of branch out towards others. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, and we're at an exciting stage now. Internally, we know that we're talking about potentially soon going to venture capital firms.
Yeah, we've been approached by a few different. VCs that we've talked with, but at the current stage we haven't raised any capital, but we do plan to do so in the coming months. I would say half a year or so, perhaps.
And I think anybody that's interested in following our journey, because that's perhaps what can be interesting in this. We've had a conversation here that's probably lasted for about an hour. We planned 30 minutes to 40 minutes, but it's been too fun.
Yeah.
So, it's going to be an interesting journey. I'm 100% sure of. So for the people that want to follow an entrepreneurial journey of this nature and see the different steps that we're going to take through this process, and here comes the plug. Please subscribe to the Business Bits channel, because this is the kind of content that we are going to keep putting out. You're going to get to follow our journey step by step. This is the phase that we're at right now. Perhaps we could have had an initial video when we first started this, but there wasn't even a YouTube channel back then, so there was nothing to put out. But from this point on, it gets very, very interesting, and I think we want to talk about the different challenges that we're going to have along the way, what's going to happen once we get that venture capital, what are the issues that we see with that venture capital, because we know that a lot of companies have talked about that as well. You think that venture capital is going to solve all your problems, and turns out it becomes a bigger problem than it is. So
I'll just add something there, just to finish off the plug there. Is you're absolutely correct that you should never rely on VC funding in order to have your company grow or be viable, like never. Because I think Paul Graham talks about this, who's founder of YC, that the whole idea that you have some companies that are like default dead and some that are default alive. So you have some companies where you can survive on just the bootstrapped environment. We chose to never. We didn't take any loans. We didn't take in any funding, and this was intentional. Simply put, in order to sort of show that we have a model that's working. We don't want to take in funding in order to sort of experiment and to try to find something that's working. We want to first show that this is working. If you put in X amount of dollars, you'll get back X amount of dollars, and you can see the growth, following according to the lifetime value of the customer. So you can sort of use the capital not in order to sort of do like R&D, let's try it out and see what works, but in order to actually use it as a catalyst, where you put on like gasoline on a fire to make it grow faster. And that's why we feel at this stage we've reached that stage where we can actually put in. If you put in capital, we can grow it faster and retain our users.
And I think we both kind of share that with that. Because we've never gone down the route of actually taking venture capital before, we respect the money, because we've struggled so much in our other projects. So we know what it takes to take something from zero to actually being able to pay for your own salary or something similar like that. And I think both of us actually kind of look down on spoiled kids that think that they should get this and this amount of valuation on a company that has a PowerPoint. So we never wanted to put ourselves in that clique. I think we wanted to show that we have a working product that, like you said, we just need fuel to the fire that's already burning. So hopefully that's going to be the storyline moving forward. You never know. This is entrepreneurship.
I agree. You never really know, but you have to try and take it one day at a time. And you can't really focus on too long sort of a landscape where you're trying to budget for 2 years in the future. A startup is not really feasible to do that. So I think we're going to take this one day at a time. And just to sort of branch out what you said before about the sort of a startup scene, I was reading a quote recently actually in Jason Calacanis' book, Angel, where he's talking about this, where the kind of founders that he's interested in, he's a very, very famous investor, most famously probably for his investment in Uber and Calm. Uber is going to define, I think, his career in many ways. But he said that he looks at companies that can survive regardless of sort of VC funding. If you don't have VC funding, they can still operate. And if you've come up from a sort of a bootstrapped environment, if the going becomes tough in the end, and you, for whatever reason, need to sort of scale down, and sort of what happened during the COVID era for some companies, they had to rethink their whole model. Then you can sort of feel assured that the founders will be able to continue on in sort of a cockroach mode. Without VC funding, they'll still go on.
I agree 100%, and I'm so glad that we took the route that we did for so many years, went without venture capital, for the reason that I believe that if you are creative without enough funds, like once you actually get funds, it's like, because I've seen this I've been a part of an incubator before as well, where all the companies got funding and everybody was so green in their knowledge and their know-how. And I just watched company after company that got more funding than they really deserved, just fall and crash and burn, because they got it too easy and nobody even respected the money that they got. So I'm going to round it off here because we've been going on for longer than we thought, but it's only because it's been so much fun, and I just hope that it's brought a lot of new information and started a journey for some people that they can follow, because some people are probably on a similar journey, some people want to start a similar journey. So I hope they can jump on this track and follow our journey as well.
Thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure.